Obviously, it's a real privilege to be taking part in this. I'm really enjoying it, and it's lovely to have met all of you. And I'm learning so much from all of you and your own particular takes and insights. So anyway, as I mentioned earlier, my PhD was on Northern Ireland and the legacy of the Troubles, a subject with obviously a huge bearing on Brexit itself. But my postdoctoral research at the Courtauld is about gender, sexuality, Brexit and visual culture. So today I'm going to be talking about masculinity. And if a lot of our discussion this morning was about 2016 and what led to the vote, now I'm going to be giving you a portrait of 2017, 2018, where the public is at right now, both Remainers and Leavers, which should hopefully be useful for us to consider. I'll talk for about 40 minutes. I hope you enjoy. From the moment it surfaced into public consciousness from London's Victorian sewers in 2017, the public began asking if the Whitechapel fatberg was a metaphor for Brexit. Lecturer Andrew Ticknell joked on Twitter, quote, "The fatberg is a Brexit dividend generated by the best beef of old England." 2 days later, journalist Christina Patterson tweeted, "This giant stinking fatberg seems, unfortunately, like the perfect metaphor for Brexit." Southend Man, 1972, took a different tack. If this country can take on and defeat a fatberg, then we can defeat the EU. Such semantics also made it into the national press, with one newspaper describing Brexit as Mrs. May's legislative fatberg. The 130-ton mass of congealed fat, excrement, condoms, nappies, oil and wet wipes that had brought Whitechapel's sewers to a standstill. But by November, BBC News reported that victory had been declared after a 9-week battle and the beast finally defeated. When a couple of fragments went on display at the Museum of London, they were described as the final chunk of a toxic monster. So why was this excremental assemblage linked to Brexit in the public's mind? The political and press discourse around the EU negotiations have been filled with food semantics. Fudge, an ambiguous position, cherry picking, dividing up the EU's 4 freedoms, cake and eat it, or cakeism, British exceptionalism. At the same time, in newspapers and on social media, both Leavers and Remainers have drawn again and again on scatological language to articulate their feelings of powerlessness at not just the process, but also the fear about the UK's loss of status on the world stage, either as a result of being too closely associated with the EU or too far outside it. In a Guardian article in September 2018, a journalist mused, "What it will all come down to, in the end, is a contest between 2 gut propositions that may have very little to do with the EU." So what might the gut have to do with Brexit? What goes in and out of us is quite clearly, in the midst of Brexit negotiations, of profound anxiety. I think at fundamental, it is an anxiety about control. Controlling what we consume and its waste products. Underneath it all, food might throw up an inner conflict we've had since birth. What does it mean to be dependent on those which could also harm us? In every relationship and every meal, we have to face the fact that the very things we rely on for support for our life could also threaten us. Such terror might fuel the desire for autonomy, but might, in fact, underscore our dependence on others. Although they are ill-defined categories, flattening a complex electorate, I will use leavers and remainers as descriptors, but my aim is to put emphasis on points of commonality. Conceptual binaries, like us and them, shape frameworks of perception, placing the focus on difference, overlooking shared imaginative worldviews. If the root of conflict is us and them thinking, to what extent are leavers and remainers, or the UK and the EU, interdependent and indelibly tied to each other? Could we follow the gut to think about possible ways of coexisting with those deemed foreign? Rather than taking back control, we may have to contemplate or come to terms with feelings of powerlessness provoked by the Brexit process. In the UK, masculinity has long been seen as a spectrum. You can have too little, effeminate, or too much, brutish. And both are seen as being out of control. It's only the figure in the middle. I'm sure you'll recognise him from Brexit Uncivil War, Leighton's An Athlete Wrestling a Python, which was in Tate at the start of the show. It's only the figure in the middle, military masculinity, that has long been seen as the only subject capable of self-control, self-discipline and self-sovereignty. In patriarchal, heteronormative, militaristic gender norms, real men must act as a benign custodian for all those who supposedly cannot exert self-mastery. Women, LGBTQ people, those deemed foreign, children, non-humans. This rhetorical narrative works to misrepresent structures of power as the greater good. Obedience to societal norms dressed up as sacrifice and duty, while selfishness or narcissism is attributed to those who challenge the status quo. So whether or not the Leave campaign slogan to take back control explicitly mentioned gender, it worked in a conceptual environment where control was closely associated with military masculinity. At the 2018 Conservative Party conference, MP Boris Johnson proclaimed that the Chequers Brexit proposal was, quote, not taking back control, it is forfeiting control. While the next day, outside the venue, Remain protesters held a funeral, exclaiming, "We've now lost control." Since the referendum, activist Gina Miller has repeatedly claimed that her side must, quote, take back control. To what extent are such demands made in association with metaphors of masculinity? In June 2017, a photoshopped image of Boris Johnson in a nappy was circulated on social media, mocked up to look like a calling card in a public phone booth. Pasted on top are the captions, "Posh adult chubby baby, clean up his mess, www.wankersoftheworld.com. Well, underneath someone has added a comment, hashtag bogjob putting the N in cuts. Femininity, non-procreative sexuality, and childishness are all being used as an insult here. Rhetorical strategies historically deployed to suggest a strong-armed male benign custodian needs to exert order. Masturbation has long been seen as a problem for military masculinity, rendering men out of control, killing unborn generations, causing ill health and even death, turning firm male flesh soft and flaccid, risking to escalate into same-sex desire. Concerns about masculinity crop up time and time again for Remainers, often in tandem with fears about a loss of status on the world stage. Brexit is like a Premier League side wanting to be relegated, one journalist exclaimed. In April 2018, Josh Pappenheim produced a viral video, Brexit Means Titanic, in which the faces of contemporary politicians are pasted over scenes from James Cameron's 1997 film. In the closing frames, former UKIP leader Nigel Farage draws a nude Donald Trump, who has been superimposed onto a woman's body. In order for the finale to work as a joke, however, it is implicitly homophobic, suggesting that there is something negative about a man drawing another man nude. Feminizing the US president in order to attack him is also misogynistic, perpetuating the idea that too much or too little masculinity is effeminate. Haunting the video is the implication that a real man is needed to save Remainers, fearful that the ship is sinking. By June 2018, a member of the public called into BBC radio show Any Answers, commenting, "When we had an empire, we could bully other countries. Now, if we leave the European Union, we will be a small boy." The next day, The Guardian also drew on gendered semantics to describe the prospect of, quote, "a Britain in decline into a sullen and impoverished island, like a divorced man drinking alone in a bedsit." What is at stake in these descriptions is the unspoken ideal that lurks in the background, the fantasy of military men as complete masters over themselves and others. Also holding out for a macho hero, Brexiteers have turned to ever more militaristic rhetoric. In June 2018, MP Nadine Dorries tweeted her support for the then Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. Quote, "David Davis is ex-SAS. He's trained to survive. He's also trained to take people out." A month later, MP Bernard Jenkin exclaimed in The Sun that Brexit victory would be like winning the Falklands War, transforming our national confidence and standing in the world. Despite such promises, the Times had begun to panic, repeatedly calling out for a male saviour, imploring in April that there's a hole in the centre made for a saviour. By July, our timid leaders can learn from strong men. And in August, end of days feel in Westminster crying out for strong leadership. Take the last account. The article opens with a description of a Conservative MP sending the journalist a video of two armed men gunning down a passenger in a vehicle to explain his philosophy of a hard Brexit. It is deeply revealing that Leaver MPs have turned to metaphors of colonialism to express their outrage at the prospect of a soft Brexit, Johnson describing the Chequers proposal as colony status. It seems strange that Johnson would see any problem with the UK becoming a colony, given in 2014 he exclaimed that countries that, quote, hadn't had the benefit of British rule were less fortunate. In 2002, Johnson wrote an article in The Spectator, republished online in July 2016, in which he pontificated, quote, "The best fate for Africa would be if the old colonial powers scrambled again in her direction, on the understanding that this time they will not be asked to feel guilty. The problem is not that we were once in charge," he explained, "but that we are not in charge anymore." Some of the shame felt by Leavers is certainly related to a difficulty swallowing the fact that the UK no longer rules the waves. Activist John Mills recently tweeted, "Less than 100 years ago, the UK had a degree of sovereignty over a quarter of the world's land surface. Next year, we will have a substantial part of our economic, commercial, and social policies controlled by a foreign organisation over which we have no control." For Johnson, a soft Brexit and the loss of control it entails raises the spectre of effeminate masculinity. In September 2018, he described the negotiations as, quote, "a humiliation. We look like a 7-stone weakling being bent comically out of shape by a 500-pound gorilla." As with the Sun front page that exclaimed "EU dirty rats" a few weeks later, animal metaphors are a classic militarism tactic, painting those perceived to be an enemy as aggressive, violent, out of control, and in need of some kind of containment. Part of the reason animals occupy such a position in the collective imagination is also related to the gender politics of meat eating. The assumption that ingestion and digestion are an act of mastery. Meat consumption has been historically associated with military male strength and vegetarianism with female weakness. Such ideas have a long history. In 1898, a medical doctor claimed that, quote, "the potato-eating Irish are kept in subjection by the well-fed English," attributing the victory at the 1815 Battle of Waterloo to Britain being a nation of beef eaters. More recently, this conceptual connection between meat eating and military masculinity has come in for ridicule with the use of the term gammon to mock angry outbursts of middle-aged pro-war men. But if both Leavers and Remainers are deeply anxious about masculinity amidst Brexit negotiations, what might metaphors of food tell us about fears of interdependence? In July 2018, Leaver MP Jacob Rees-Mogg exclaimed, quote, "As with eggs, an egg that is very softly boiled isn't boiled at all. A very soft Brexit means we are simply a rule taker." The metaphor collapses independence or resistance to rule taking with solid material states, using semi-liquid semantics to describe being out of control. The UK's Brexit discourse has drawn heavily on food semantics. In February 2018, a former World Trade Organization chief warned that Brexit was like removing an egg from an omelette. And an ex-government trade official exclaimed that leaving the EU in search of trade deals elsewhere was like giving up a 3-course meal now in favour of the promise of a packet of crisps. In this context, British artist Michael Landy exhibited his artwork open for business from June to October last year at the Riga Biennial in Latvia. A Union Jack adorned kiosk that sold tinned food like baked beans and spam, and sealed snacks, crisps, chocolate, alongside Lever and Remainer merchandise, while a handwritten sign next to the hatch advised visitors to apply within for trade deals. Amid tea towels adorned with the word Brexit, or tiny blue plastic bin toys with symbols of a figure throwing away the EU, were also condoms covered in the Union Jack flag with the words "Hard Brexit." While they may have tapped into a desire to contain leaky excess, like the toy bin and tea towel, when I spoke to Landy, he explained that the condom represented a kind of masculinity that was, quote, very limp and jingoistic, to show its patheticness, to amplify how stilted and flaccid it really is, and how powerless we really are when it comes down to it. The installation was situated in the grounds of Latvia University's former Faculty of Biology, the main site of the biennial. I got chatting to the man who staffed the shop, a British national with an Irish passport who had left Manchester in response to the referendum. Despite having moved to Latvia in an attempt to escape Brexit, he had ended up trapped in Landy's performance installation, which he described as a bunker in an annex away from the rest of the biennial, but dependent on it for meals. While the artwork was on display, the UK government announced that it would be stockpiling food in the case of a no deal, prompting The Guardian to offer readers a no-deal Brexit survival guide, what food to stockpile. While their restaurant critic asked, "Food and Brexit, will our cupboards be bare?" The ability to eat may be closely tied to our fears and fantasies of survival, but in fact, it may be a question of dependency that itself introduces a profound anxiety. Obviously, the news story on the right is a parody story, but I thought it was useful for what I'm going to go on to talk about. Psychoanalyst Melanie Klein's work on breastfeeding might throw up some of the stakes at play here. Neonates, she argues, utterly depend on caregivers for life. And yet, they are aware that they could die if that shelter and sustenance was withdrawn. This tension leads to conflicted feelings on the part of the child. The desire to be autonomous in a situation where dependency is an irrefutable fact of life. Eating is a particular focal point for such an anxiety, demanding an unlimited flow of milk and love. But out of the fear, such provision will never materialize. The child may project badness, this is a quote, badness, primarily bad excrements and bad parts of the self, into the mother. First of all, into her breast, in order to spoil and destroy her. The idea that another person could be both the support for life and yet also threaten it can be intolerable, leading to a child splitting that person into good and bad in their mind. The ideal breast is the counterpart to the devouring breast. This reaction is a management strategy, an attempt to try and parcel up sources of harm from sustenance in order to feel more in control and less dependent on those who could withdraw support at any time. Although this is a defense mechanism that may stay with us for the rest of our lives, it does not mean that the subject has got rid of such dependency in actuality. After all, the attempt to split people in two does not actually split them. Autonomy is not possible. And the only way to work through the anxieties that result is to come to terms with the fact that one cannot be a master of others, or an absolute master anyway. Food is a source of considerable worry in the midst of Brexit negotiations, with threats to UK-EU supply routes by a no deal. But what we eat also throws up questions about who we are. Some leavers may romanticise food scarcity that Brexit might bring. A Conservative Party member recently proclaimed, quote, "I'd rather have a no deal than a bad deal. If this country had a chance and an opportunity, it could look after itself. In the Second World War, we were feeding ourselves." But it is quite significant that this rhetoric is being employed decades after the event. It is a fantasy from a position of food abundance, resurrecting a retrospective idea of national unity. Fueling this thinking is the drive for mastery, the refusal to acknowledge that whether inside or outside the EU, the UK will be dependent on its neighbours to survive. Such a desire for autonomy has been mocked. Mark Blakewell and James Harris's parody publication, The Brexit Cookbook, published under the pseudonym Nigel Sewage, lists British meals alongside European counterparts, the former stamped with approved and the latter vetoed. Something that seemed no less satirical, although it was not intended to be so, was the announcement in June 2018 by Leave campaigner and owner of J.D. Wetherspoon's pub chain that European foreign alcohol would be banned in his business. The anxiety to expel all those deemed to be foreign, an urge that also manifests in the desire to take back control of the UK's borders, borrows heavily from the imaginative fantasy about purity and pollution. Semantics, of course, that have long informed a racist discourse. In her anthropological work on dirt, which she defines as matter out of place, Mary Douglas argues that the borders of the human body often stand in as metaphors for the boundaries of social groups. She explains, quote, "The body is a model which can stand for any bounded system. Its boundaries can represent any boundaries that are threatened or precarious. The policing of borders, symbolic, corporeal, geopolitical, are an attempt to impose ideas of control. Quote, ideas about separating, purifying, demarcating, and punishing transgressions have as their main function to impose a system on an inherently untidy experience. It is by exaggerating the differences within and without that a semblance of order is created. But such a desire to violently impose a system will be perpetually haunted by the fear of failure. For the mess of fleshy bodies are not so easy to control in reality. Douglas points out, quote, any structure of ideas is vulnerable at the margins. we should expect that the orifices of the body to symbolize its specifically vulnerable points. Urine, feces, or tears, simply by issuing forth, have traversed the boundaries of the body. The mistake is to treat bodily margins in isolation from all other social margins. If the drive to impose order over symbolic, national, and corporeal boundaries is fundamentally propelled by the hunger to take back control, have metaphors of eating and excreting proliferated so much in the Brexit discourse precisely because of a terror of the prospect of such control or neatly sealed borders seem to be slipping away as the negotiations progress. The things that taste of Brexit hashtag, which emerged on Twitter in May 2018, certainly seem deeply concerned with ingestion. Responses ranged from Iron Meister's photo of a pile of bacon, toast, a fried egg, tea and a gun, to Mark Phillips' description of a rancid turd. Supporters of Brexit tried to look for traditional British food. Quote, Sunday dinner, Cornish pasty, full English breakfast, fish and chips. Remainer ideas tended to be much more liquid. Cold custard with a horrible film skin on the top of it, tripe and lard, 3-week-old gravy, the bile in the throats of very hungry children. While the two sides may have posted very different material, both were marked by a profound anxiety of what goes in and out of the body during Brexit negotiations. Remainers and leavers have also turned to scatological metaphors to express the sense of powerlessness they felt at the prospect of either a soft or any Brexit. As the Museum of London Fatberg went on display, Twitter was awash with sewer and excremental semantics to describe the state of negotiations. David Mills claimed, quote, Brexit's flaring up like an untreated and intractable virus. Tories a total shit show. Cave Art Films was keen to add, Brexit is made of poo. Whether it is hard or soft doesn't change a whole lot. It needs to be flushed away. While Steve Chambers took a different tack. Brexit is the start of cleansing Britain from the vermin who write such threatening poison. All sides invoke slime, swamp, virus, and excrement imagery in order to call for some kind of symbolic impurity to be ejected from an imagined body. And yet, such metaphors are continually reanimated, called upon time and time again by a British public who increasingly feel frustrated that they cannot banish all that they feel to be contagious. The fear of drowning in a sewer of filth increasingly becomes a way of articulating a sense of intense powerlessness at the Brexit process. Remain supporting newspaper cartoons have repeatedly turned to anal, excretal or mud metaphors to attack Brexit. To take a few examples, Steve Bell in The Guardian portrayed Johnson's face as an anus, Davis talking out of his arse, Davis and MP Michael Gove emerging from animal backsides. In the same paper, Rowson depicted Conservative MPs wading through the mud of the 1917 Battle of Passchendaele and a bucket of excrement labelled Brexit. In The Independent, Brian Adcock drew a slimy snail sprouting the heads of 4 Brexiteer MPs and Conservative MPs throwing mud at each other across a giant Brexit sign. Dave Brown, Drew Hammond farting while being carried on a stretcher into a photograph of a muddy First World War trench. May adorned with an HMS Titanic cap, drowning in a flood of excrement and rats. The Prime Minister squatting in the sky above Parliament, about to excrete, or a cross-section of her head firmly up her own anus. Slime, mush, and liquid semantics are drawn on time and time again to express a sense of drowning, of being out of control. Are such excremental metaphors associated with anxieties about infantile state of powerlessness? On BBC Radio 4 show, The Ministry of Leave, broadcast in February 2018, Jenkin expressed dismay with, as he saw it, how, quote, the last of the Remain tendency are deep within the bowels of the Treasury. There is an attempt being made to drag out the process and soften it. A few months later, Johnson demanded more guts from the British negotiators, warning of, quote, bog roll Brexit, soft, yielding, and seemingly infinitely long. In response, The Guardian described his views on the subject as, quote, a massive fecal log, which temporarily blocks the U-bend in the British news bog with his latest stinking offering, before standing next to the bowl and gesturing at its produce like a delighted toddler, expecting parental praise for his mastery of basic bowel functions. Is such imagery being used to call forth forms of containment, or the idea that a real man should come along and sweep away all the mush and morass? I want to return to the Museum of London Fatberg to consider what is at stake in the gendered metaphors of eating and excreting in the Brexit imagination. If the fatberg is a metaphor for Brexit, what might it tell us about our own fantasies and fears of control, or the prospect of having to face our own feelings of powerlessness in the midst of negotiations? Was the Museum of London exhibition an attempt to contain a messy mass of abject matter precisely at a time when Leavers and Remainers were feeling increasingly out of control? Visitors to the show were greeted with a full-length set of protective overalls worn by those who waged war on the fatberg. The walls of the display were adorned with warning tape, biohazard symbols, and quotes proclaiming the beast has finally been defeated. And a video display in which the Conservators explained they dried out and tightly sealed off the fatberg fragments to try and reduce the risk of passing on diseases. The final traces of the fatberg sit, in two cases, reduced to small soil-like clumps, crumbling dust, unlike the photos of it pre-defeat, which adorned the gallery walls, wet and semi-liquid in the sewer. As I stood in the exhibition, two reactions seemed to crop up time and time again: disgust and disappointment. While the tote bags and the t-shirts from the museum shop depicted a giant sticky monster crawling out of the building or sold fatberg fudge, there was something particularly underwhelming about the delivery of the fatberg itself, precisely because of the lengths the curators and the Conservators went to contain it, eventually removing it from public display and putting it online via webcam. The press may have cast the extraction and exhibition of the fatberg as a victory in a war against the toxic monster, a sentiment Southend man projected onto Brexit. But despite the attempts to remove exactly what was felt to be threatening about it, did it still exert a sense of unease and anxiety? After the defeat of the Whitechapel fatberg, numerous others have continued to coalesce under London and elsewhere, at every appearance threatening a sense of mastery over excremental mush ejected from the body. Are there implications for gender here? Not only does the continuous re-emergence of new fatbergs undermine the fantasy of the male custodian, exerting order over all others, it seems that the chemicals found in them were also the cause for alarm. The discovery in April 2018 that a fatberg in Southwark contained high levels of muscle-building gym supplements led to newspapers questioning the implications for masculinity, while an academic warned that the plasticizers found, quote, mimic the actions of estrogens, which have implications for aquatic organisms. Perhaps imagined to be both excessively masculine and hyperfeminine at the same time. After all, too much masculinity has long been seen as tipping over into unmanliness. The semi-liquid, amorphous mush of the fatberg was certainly a source of considerable terror in the press. Anxieties about gender and metaphors of sticky morass have a longer European history, bound up with 20th century wars. In Klaus Tewelite's psychoanalytic study of German interwar masculinity, he observes how soldiers returning from the First World War saw pacifists back home as slimy and pulp-like. One thought, quote, surely we are closer to our enemies than any pacifist. Surely we are achieving something more important, killing each other here, than if we were to coalesce into some great pulpy mishmash. Helpless at the end of conflict, many soldiers felt they had soiled themselves, rendered in a state of childishness where childhood is understood as a metaphor for being out of control. The centenary of the First World War certainly haunts the Brexit negotiations, and so too does the spectre of such a pulpy mishmash, as newspaper cartoons from 2018 evidence. To mark the centenary of the Battle of Passchendaele, in July 2017, Dutch artist Damien van der Velden exhibited the Mud Soldier in London's Trafalgar Square. Made out of Flanders mud, the sculpture of a soldier slumped on the ground was encased in a metal frame that sprayed artificial rain. Over the course of 5 days, his body transformed into mud and mush, excremental flows of sludge and slime. The statue was lauded in the Conservative press, described as, quote, a fitting tribute to their sacrifice by the Telegraph, and, quote, commemorating the soldiers' bravery, struggle and sacrifice by the Daily Express. But were these accounts attempting to cast the artwork in the rhetoric of duty in order to try and offset something deeply troubling about the sculpture? The point of militarism, after all, is to present an idealized fantasy of conflict, far from the traumatic mess. Take Christopher Nolan's World War II film Dunkirk, released the same month. While it tells the story of defeat and death, at no point do the bodies of male soldiers even begin to resemble the Mud Soldier. because to do so would undermine the movie's pro-war message. On the film's release, Farage tweeted his approval. In a climate where Leavers repeatedly compare Brexit to World War II. In October 2018, the Daily Mail photoshopped Davis's face onto the photo of a Battle of Britain Spitfire pilot, underscoring the conceptual connection between the war and Brexit and the implications for masculinity. The Brexit supporting press was particularly complimentary of Dunkirk, with the Telegraph describing the film as heroically British. Other papers pointed out the exclusion of soldiers of colour from across the empire as a whitewashing of history, and by also marginalising the French troops, it created an impression of a UK standing alone, surviving against all odds. "Survival is victory," exclaimed the on-screen titles of the movie trailer. Empire magazine approvingly explained, quote, "Rather than heroics, Nolan is concerned with what men can endure," overlooking the fact that the rhetoric of endurance and military masculinity have long gone hand in hand. It is worth noting, by contrast, the mud soldier does not endure. It was quickly washed away into a sticky brown swamp, unlike the other stone or bronze statues of military men in Trafalgar Square. One only needs glance at the British Army recruitment ads on social media to see that they certainly would not use the mud soldier for a campaign. None of the men in the photographs they circulate online are wounded or traumatized, or in fact anything other than the epitome of health. Soldiers are considered the pinnacle of masculinity, associated with solid or stone material metaphors, while liquidity or softness is often ascribed to subjects imagined to being out of control: effeminate men, women, LGBTQ people, those deemed foreign. Think of the way the Daily Mail repeatedly describes migrants as waves and floods. But the mud soldier troubles such a neat conceptual binary, rendering the figure of military masculinity wet, leaky, and cascading in rivers of brown sludge. What does this image of British-European relations mean in the midst of Brexit talks? In October 2018, Rees-Mogg registered his dissatisfaction with the negotiations by asking, "Why is the government so wet?" while Remain activist Otto English described Davis as a poisonous slug. Meanwhile, The Independent published a cartoon of Johnson as a slimy green sea monster. When the withdrawal agreement was made public, the Sun screamed, "We're in the Brexit." Do these wet, slimy, semi-liquid material qualities of the mud soldier and the Museum of London Fatberg share something in common here? Perhaps in the context of Brexit talks, these pieces of material culture might raise the spectre of humiliation, shame, or associations with childish effeminacy. But rather than struggle against such feelings, now may precisely be the time for Britain to face the prospect of coming to terms with them. While various Leavers and Remainers have both internalised a fantasy of the UK as a major player on the world stage and feel anguish at that idea slipping away, maybe we should dwell on the sense of insignificance and the loss of mastery. Rather than strive to recreate a sense of sovereignty or the male custodian figure, shouldn't we come to terms with the fact the UK is a small nation, dependent on its neighbours to survive. Following the announcement of the withdrawal agreement, Shirl 2702 condemned the government as, quote, a bunch of wet weekends. Nigel Farage is the only one who has the balls. While Remainer MP Heidi Allen exclaimed, quote, MPs must grow a pair. And The Guardian demanded the muscle of Parliament take back control. But maybe this is a moment to rethink ideas of masculinity held by both sides. Criticism has been levelled at Brexit's toxic masculinity, but toxicity as a metaphor borrows from the conceptual discourse of purity and pollution, so heavily implicated in homophobia, misogyny, militarism, and racism. We do not need to perpetuate this imaginative worldview, even as we do the important work dismantling the narrative foundations of the male custodian. We can and must abandon military masculinity as an organising principle for society, and along with it, rhetoric of health and sacrifice to misrepresent structures of power as the greater good. Rather than use effeminacy or non-procreative sexuality as an insult and demand men take back control, perhaps we can stick with the wet, wobbly, excremental mush of the fatberg and the mud soldier. Instead of seeing these material metaphors as states of shame for the sense of powerlessness they evoke, they might offer an image of masculinity not defined by controlling others. Leave-supporting TV presenter Piers Morgan recently warned feminists not to, quote, turn men into a bunch of neutered, grovelling, blubbering doormats. But it is vital to give image to kinds of masculinity that are not based on the domination of others. In the case of the mud soldier, there is no macho, muscular male hero to save the day and restore the UK to an imagined position of ruling the waves. In fact, it is that very figure that has collapsed into excretal mush and been washed away. Could we hold on to this sense of powerlessness? The UK will have to face its diminished status on the world stage. We will not be able to eradicate our interconnectedness with Europe or between the two sides of the referendum divide. Both Leavers and Remainers may use scatological metaphors in order to call to expel foreign substances, but we can never have total mastery over ourselves or others. If gut metaphors are a way of both sides articulating their anxiety about being dependent on those considered threatening, it also underscores that very interdependence. Maybe there is a lesson to learn here. Not only can we not take back control, but the very desire to have total control in the first place was only ever going to fall short. We must swallow our entanglement with others and the indelible ties that constitute us. Thank you. I don't know if anyone has any questions. I've probably run over a bit.
Team, would anyone like to, or any of the audience like to pose any questions for Edwin? Comments?
Do you think we could use food in our, post-campaign?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, it's obviously a cause of like massive anxiety that's hugely important for people. In terms of campaigning, the People's Vote had a pop-up shop in Peckham, which was used to mimic an off-licence that had been starved of supplies in a post-Brexit future, which was very interesting. And Momentum produced a video recently that had someone preparing a cake as a metaphor for describing May's negotiation process and how badly wrong it had gone. I mean, given that it's such a fundamental thing that's of profound importance to all of us and something that we all relate to, it would make sense to think about it as a reference point, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Really interested in the kind of psychoanalysis aspect, like to read it through ideas of disgust and repulsion, things like that. I guess it's a similar question in a certain way, but more abstract. Like, is it possible to conceive of, because what you're pointing towards is how disgust has been, how like the psychological aspect of disgust has been used to push a particular political agenda. I guess I'm wondering what's the opposite of that? What's the alternative? Because of course you've shown how disgust can be used to deploy political things. How to combat that? Yeah. or is there any other sort of framework which maybe could be psychoanalytic or otherwise, which could be used to, for example, support the Remain campaign, instead of some kind of progressive politics or whatever?
I mean, I think that's a brilliant question. I mean, both were. And I don't have a simple answer. So maybe this is something we can discuss more afterwards. In psychoanalytic terms, the only way to the way to stop perpetuating that cycle of horror and looking for enemies and lashing out and feeling under attack is to be able to come to terms with
the abject.
Yeah. And also that actually, and if I was to then draw on pacifist theory, it would be an understanding that none of us can be autonomous, actually. None of us can just cut off that which we imagine to be threatening and eject it, that we're actually indelibly tied to each other.
Yeah.
And there is no way of being a subject outside of. I mean, how that translates into a campaign is more complex.
See, I think that's a good answer, actually, because it's a question of saying, because one of the problems here is that people experience these desires to repel the repulsive or whatever. And the point is that those desires are not in fact their own, and it's impossible to experience those desires kind of free of politics or whatever. So even maybe trying to make that point somehow would be useful, I think. Yeah, but I think that's a good answer. Thanks. Definitely lots to think about.
Thank you. Yeah, John.
I found your point about meat eating and vegetarianism very interesting in the sense that meat eating is traditionally been associated with very masculine, self-controlled imagery, but I think it's also possible to turn it around as well, that in a way you need sort of less energy and resources to go vegetarian food, so in a sense that is more self-sufficient. And there's also been a countercurrent in history to show vegetarians and vegans as being more aesthetic and less dependent on the needs of the flesh, and therefore having more self-control and self-sufficiency.
That's interesting, yeah.
So I think you can have both narratives, and it depends where you need to.
Definitely. And actually I come at this, I'm interested in food and eating, having written about hunger striking as a political tactic. Obviously hunger striking in Northern Ireland, like Bobby Sands. And there, of course, the idea, which is heavily interconnected with masculinity in that context, which is the control over a body that's starving itself, and not ingesting, with such a sense of endurance, and not needing to eat, which is obviously also at play in some of the references to the Second World War, in the Lever imagination. That sense of, well, rationing would be good for us, We need to starve ourselves a bit. And obviously the Second World War was also a time where meat would have been a lot harder to access, and there was this whole idea of growing your own veg, which has been, mocked by people like papers like New European, which created a poster of Theresa May holding a cauliflower to kind of make fun of that idea of. But obviously, ultimately, the thing about hunger striking, for Bobby Sands and 9 other men, is that you take that logic to its ultimate conclusion and you die. So actually although people can convince themselves that they are more in control of their lives one way or another, actually none of us are absolutely. There are always other forces at play. And the whole idea, and this is why the slogan of the referendum was so important but also so disingenuous, is that none of us can actually take back control at all. And actually what's interesting about the Brexit and Civil War film that I'm sure most of you watched on Monday is, I imagine, absolutely fictionally, it's styles this epiphany where Dominic Cummings comes up with the slogan when he's reading a book about what it would be like to become a father and the sense of loss and trauma that might involve. And rather than pick up the message that the book, I imagine, is telling, which is you're just going to have to come to terms with it and let it go, his reaction is, I can use this as a political weapon, you know. So there are some really deep-seated psychological and psychoanalytic issues at play in all of this. Thanks for your question. Thanks.